We have, all right, we are recording. So we say it again. Welcome to everyone around the world and here in Paris. This is a wonderful opportunity to have a closing ceremony and closing panel on the urgent need to link transformations research with policy and practice. My name is Suzanne Moser. I'm a senior advisor to the International Science Council's Transformations to Sustainability program, and it's my great honor today to moderate this particular panel. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I want to introduce in a moment the panelists, but let me quickly say a couple of words on the technicalities of this. We're doing this as a Zoom webinar, so you have an opportunity to enter any questions that you have or comments that you have in the Q&A panel on your screen. The chat will be used just to share links and information with you. But if you have any questions, please put it there. We will monitor it and have a Q&A session towards the end of this particular discussion. So let me say a word about the International Science Council. ISC is an umbrella organization of around 200 scientific organizations, including science academies and disciplinary unions. It is convening this meeting on behalf of the funding partners of the T2S, the Transformations to Sustainability program, namely the Belmont Forum and the NORFACE network. Let me set the stage. We're here in the final days of COP27. We're here at a moment when global average temperature warming is already 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We're here a few years before the UN Agenda 2030, the Sustainability Development Goals are supposed to be met. We all know the urgency with which we need to transform to sustainability. And the challenge is, it couldn't be underlined how important and urgent it is for us at this moment. We're also here at a very pivotal moment for the T2S program, this research program that has run for 10 years and is coming to a close. And so I'm joined here by a series of individuals who have been involved in this program, either in birthing it or in participating and contributing to it. And it's my great pleasure to welcome each of you here. Thank you for joining us. Let me briefly introduce them one at a time, and then we get into the discussion. My great pleasure to introduce Heide Hackmann, who is now the Director of Future Africa and a strategic advisor on transdisciplinarity and global knowledge networks at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Just prior to that, she was the ISC's inaugural Chief Executive Officer and is also now a member of the Global Commission on Science Missions for Sustainability. Maybe most importantly, for this particular panel, she envisioned and launched the T2S program nearly a decade ago. And this brings both a historical perspective to this panel, but also really a broad perspective on transformation science and in the science and policy contexts. We have Leo Salana, who is the coordinator of the India-based Environment Support Group, a not-for-profit addressing various environmental and social justice challenges of vulnerable communities and voiceless ecosystems, working through complexities of law, policy, politics, and countering the widespread and deliberate misrepresentation of science and traditional knowledge and wisdoms. He has contributed to one of the research projects in the most recent generation of T2S of the T2S program. Eleanor Fischer is head of research at the Nordic Africa Institute in Sweden. She's a social scientist with 30 years experience working on international and sustainable development issues, with a recent body of work encompassing transformative change and sustainability issues. She too has contributed to the T2S research program in one of the projects, but also has edited a special issue of papers that have emerged out of the research. So she brings a very broad perspective. And then we have Adrian Eli, a reader in technology and sustainability and co-director in policy training and executive education in the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the UK. Adrian co-led one of the multi-project transformative knowledge networks, as we called it, the one on pathways to sustainability in the first generation of this research program. And he was also a lead editor of a book that resulted from that set of case studies. And last but not least, Mariana Walter is an ecological economist and political ecologist based at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Mariana's research addresses extractive industries, social metabolism, socio-environmental conflicts, environmental justice, knowledge of co-production, and social transformations. She played a leading role in one of the other transformative knowledge networks that was the Acknowledge TKN, where she was the scientific coordinator and co-editor of an edited volume of their particular set of case studies. So welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for joining this webinar at this pivotal moment and for all your contributions to this program. So I want to get us started with a little bit of a focus on giving background to this program, the history, the vision, the ambition that the Transformations to Sustainability program had. Heide, can I start with you? Just giving us a bit of the history on this research program, what motivated it, how did you envision it and design it, and what were your goals for this program? So lay out a little bit of the two generations of T2S research projects and what made it exciting for you.
Sure. Thank you, Susan, and thank you to you and Sarah and the other organizers for including me in this. I almost feel quite emotional about this being the closing session of the close of a program. But then, as you said that, I thought this is another thing for T2S to be proud of. So many programs just drag on and on and on. So by closing, we create the opportunity to create something new and build on what has been accomplished. So I just wanted to say that up front. So I could talk for a long time about the history of phase 1 and phase 2. Please keep an eye on the time and give me a signal when I should stop. You know, it's an interesting story, the development of the program, because it's really about the history of science at the international level. It's a history of relations between the natural and social sciences, of relations between what were then ISSC and ICSU, so the International Science Councils. It's a history, therefore, of the ISC, and it's a history of funding patterns and changes in funding relations, and I'll try to touch on some of that. So phase 1 started, I don't know how many of the colleagues online will remember that Future Earth, what is now the Global Sustainability Science Network, co-sponsored by the ISC, was launched in 2012 as the result of a merger between what were then international global environmental change programs. And those programs were all co-sponsored by ICSU, the Natural Science Council, and the ISSC was a kind of silent co-sponsor of the International Human Dimensions of Global Environmental Change program. So everybody will have their own story about why that process of establishing Future Earth was started. But essentially, I think if one digs deep, it was essentially about a recognition of the broader global environmental change community, that we needed to bring the natural and the social sciences more closely together, so that we needed to push the interdisciplinarity and the integrated knowledge for solutions domain. And, you know, I must say that in those days, we didn't think much about the engineering and humanities and all the other disciplines. It was a very clear focus, natural, social science. And so therefore, this is, as I've said, also a story about the relations between ICSU and what was then ISSC, because when at the very first meeting that led to the merger of those programs and the establishment of Future Earth, as executive director of the International Social Science Council at the time, I literally had to bully myself into the room. And a nice, I think it's anecdotal, but it's very indicative of the situation at the time, was that people knew that they needed the social sciences, but there was deep confusion and suspicion. They didn't know what we could contribute, and they didn't know how to work with us. And it was funny, I was invited onto what became the Future Earth Transition Task Team, and very specifically as an observer and in my personal capacity. I think that says it all. It's a wonderful sort of, motto for what was going on at the time. So there we were talking with the natural sciences about establishing this integrated global merged initiative. Around about the same time, the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, had decided to start funding the international councils. And they had invited ICSU to develop a 5-year proposal. And I think, having heard me bang on about the social sciences and how critical they were and that the natural sciences could never solve the world's problems on their own, SIDA said, all right, well, make a proposal, do something, submit a 5-year grant agreement proposal. And it was so obvious at the time what we needed to do. We needed to put the social sciences in the lead of an integrated program, of the kind of program that Future Earth was pursuing or aiming for. And more practically, we needed to use that to show what difference the social sciences can make, why they're important. Of course, transdisciplinarity was part of the architecture of the program, but and more than that, the need for us to understand what we mean by social transformation. How do you recognize it when you see it? What works, what doesn't work? How did it happen? So, but that's, the making the case for the social sciences was at the heart of that first proposal. SIDA was intrigued, but not persuaded. And so they gave us money for about 2 years to do preparatory work. That was interesting. And that, Susie, as you will remember, led to 2 publications that I think were transformative. The one was the Transformative Cornerstones of Social Science Research for Global Change, based on interviews that we did with social scientists at the time who you couldn't ignore, sort of the name recognition social scientists. Eleanor Ostrom was one of them, and co-authored that with Asun, Leris, and Claire. And then the 2013 World Social Science Report on Changing Global Environments, in which you played such an important role. And SIDA got it after these 2 publications. And phase 1 was born and then put into the capable hands of Sarah and you and many others. And that was phase 1. Then phase 2, equally interesting, because because of Future Earth, we had been invited as ISSC still to become, Belmont Forum was established at the same time as the Future Earth discussion started. And it was really, at that stage, a club of the CEOs or heads of agencies of primarily natural science funders, a small group, and very closed meetings. Again, we bullied our way in one way or another, and they tolerated us. And then I think it was in Kyoto in 2017, perhaps, where we presented the Transformative Cornerstones work and the vision for this T2S program. And some of the funders, bless them, got it, and particularly the European Commission. It took years still to get NORFACE and Belmont Forum to come on board because of obstacles that the funders had at the time. Multilateral funding had just started. And so we needed to navigate that terrain. And the European Commission was very creative. They had a funding instrument that allowed them to give incentive to the NORFACE agencies to come together to support this program, and similar relations with the Belmont Forum. So that was phase 2 born. What made it exciting? For me, the politics of it all and the negotiations, unique. It was social sciences at a global level, multilateral funding with good funding, talking and people taking transformation seriously. Maybe I'll stop there and I can do my thing about what is still needed now later. Thanks, Susie.
That sounds great, but I want you to say one more word about the importance of bringing in the Global South in a leading role, given the huge gaps in capacity and the capacity building aspect of the program. I don't think many people know about that. So I wonder if you could just mention that a little bit too.
Yeah, I think that's the value of working with the donor agencies like SIDA. So they insisted in the design of the program on what we are now talking about in terms of, more equitable global collaboration. I think T2S was way ahead of the curve there in making and building that into the criteria for funding.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, let's just hear a little bit from our panelists here of what we have actually learned in 10 years of doing collaborative, integrated, transdisciplinary science and capacity building in many of the projects with co-leadership from the Global South. And I just would, love to sort of invite comments. We've just spent 2.5 days here to, if you will, coalesce and distill some of those key findings and insights that we generated. So I'd love to have each of you to speak from your perspective, from your experience in the project. What were some of the key insights that you have gleaned that you're taking away from from your projects, but also from the program as a whole? So how about Leah, we start with you.
Thanks, Susie.
And do speak up. Are you on mute? Let me just quickly figure out the technicalities. Are you on mute on your?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, good. Go ahead.
So I think in terms of working with partners from across the world, it's an opportunity which most researchers and activists from the Global South do not have. So in that sense, I think to have envisaged the possibility that you have a fund which is created to make that happen. In a sense, it's making the impossible happen. Oftentimes we work in silos, we don't relate with each other's work, but there's so much to relate with. And there are all sorts of transformations that are happening globally, regressive and progressive. And to be able to actually listen to each other's experiences with those transformations and to see and ask the question if it is a transformation towards sustainability is one of the most important aspects of this project. And to have been participant in that and to be able to relate with ideas which are new or emerging or evolving, I think that's the exciting part of it. And transformation requires direction. And when you think about how you formulate your actions towards sustainability, to be able to be confident that the direction you have taken is the right one is probably the most affirming aspect of this project. So I'm really grateful to be part of this.
Thank you so much, Leo. Eleanor, how about you? What do you take away?
Yes, thank you very much, Susie. I think I'd highlight 3 points that have come from these days of work, but also my understanding, editing the special issue and from being part of a transformation project. And the first one relates to a focus on the power and politics, the transformation. I think everybody who's been involved in this workshop over the last 2 days has very strong consensus that transformation is contested, political, messy, and that's what social science brings to the table. Within that, the nuanced insight that has emerged on working on the challenges, perspectives, actors in the Global South, and particularly how to work with marginalized communities, people who have been cut out from development processes and having a voice in development. So how to bring those voices to the table, which also brings into focus the question of whose visions of transformation or desirable futures are being privileged and how transformation processes can be just and equitable. I think that brings to a second point, which touches very nicely on Heidi's starting point, which is the achievement of coming to the end of a program in order for there to be the start of new things. And one of the focuses on capacity building aspect in the program, working with the Global South, is just how much further we need to go in terms of equitable global collaboration, decolonization of knowledge, feminization of knowledge, and pluralization of perspectives on transformation. And I think that will bring me to my final point, which is also being very attuned to the danger of maladaptation in the sense of interventions having the potential to actually introduce more harm than good. And I think there's a wealth of insight that has emerged on perhaps how best to avoid this danger. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. That's really great points. Adrian, how about you? What are you taking away?
Yeah, well, Eleanor's already said transformation itself is contested, but I'd also point out sustainability more generally is full of tensions, conflicts between vested interests and citizens, between countries and regions, and also across generations, but also more deeply across different worldviews, or what we call framings of sustainability. I think much of the research across the transformative knowledge networks, the first phase of projects that I was involved in, has really shown us the power of bringing together people and groups with these different framings, and taught us how to use social science methods to productively try and overcome the tensions and to foster and steer transformations. And there are examples from across the TKNs, the transformative knowledge networks, the empathy-based approaches from Dylan McGarry and colleagues in the T-Learning Network, the conflict transformations framework from Joaquín Rodriguez and Mirna Inturias, and the Red Confluencias working with Acknowledge, and Per Olsen and Laura Pereira's work around transformation labs, which played an important role in our network, in the Pathways Network. And that's been applied in different ways, in different contexts. So for example, our colleagues in Mexico, Lakshmi, Charlie, Joseph, really used this idea of T-Labs bring together community members to explore and build what they call collective agency within communities, so that they're better able to respond not only to sustainability challenges, but also to other challenges. For example, the collective agency also became apparent in the incidents around the earthquake that hit Mexico during the period of the project.
Great. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. And I'm just noticing, just pointing that out to everyone, there are great resources being put in the chat for everyone to follow in more depth. And so, Mariana, let me turn to you. What are your insights from this that you take away? What are the highlights? Are you on mute?
Sorry, no, I muted alone. Sorry. So hello, everybody. I just wanted to show you all the community, because it's only 5 of us, but it has been amazing to hear about all the different projects that are here today discussing results. So as Adrian was mentioning, and some of us, we are mentioning some of the outcomes, but there are many others. So maybe from the first generation and the Acknowledge and Pathways and the learning discussions, that I would like maybe to stress something that we've been working, and I think it's one of the lessons I would like to share with all of you, is that a transformation to sustainability calls for radical and systemical societal changes. But who are the agents of these transformations? Surprisingly absent from this conversation are usually activists, communities, and movements on the ground, who are actually those that are struggling and building social transformation, crafting alternatives, and recreating their words from the ground up. They maybe don't use terms like transformation, sustainability, or even environment, but we have learned together through these past years, and we keep on learning from them, how just and sustainable transformations happen, especially from and in the global south. And such lessons are particularly relevant nowadays, when climate and pandemic crises are fostering accelerated top-down technocratic and authoritarian paths that are making invisible and sometimes disabling ongoing bottom-up transformative processes. Yes, I would like to share that.
Okay.
We can keep on discussing.
Yes, wonderful. And you all set the stage really wonderful by pointing to the politics and the really the importance of working with people, I want to say on the ground, because you've all chosen to do this in very different contexts with communities or at higher levels of scale. But so I want to turn a little bit to this question. The title of this webinar is Pivot and Leap. We're in an urgent situation. In many ways, the work that we've been doing takes a lot of time. We've said it in the last 2.5 days and over 10 years, many, many times, just how slow and deliberate we have to be, right? Going at the speed of trust to build these relationships to the people who are doing a lot of the transformational work. But we are doing that at this moment of great urgency. So can you all speak a little bit to this this intersection of how do we make this important research relevant to people in communities, in policy positions, so that we can feed the insights we have gained into high-level processes as they're going on right now. So each of you would be welcome to start. I don't know if one of you want to start. How about starting from the Eleanor? How about you? I'll just point to you, and we'll get to everyone else.
Would you like some examples?
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. We're very lucky. We've been privileged to hear many examples over the last 2 days in this workshop. But I was canvassing colleagues before this webinar on some of the examples of how their work has been influencing, taken up within policy and processes of policy and practice. For example, Tapestry, projects working on practices of transformation in marginalized communities affected by climate change. Have the example of in this Mumbai in India, working with communities to address issues of plastic waste, and then taking this very successfully to policymakers in order to generate bottom-up action. So that would be one example that I would give to you, Susie.
Great.
Another, from another part of the world, is the True Craft project, which is working in Nicaragua on dominant pathways within agriculture and how one can shift away from those pathways. Why I wanted to bring this as an example is because we have researchers and activists working in a very, very difficult political context. So there, in that context, it's not possible to, at the moment, be trying to influence policy, but what their work has done in terms of one practical way forward is working on methodology that can then be make aware of how knowledge can be biased, and then how do you address biases in knowledge when you're working with communities. So those are two of the examples that I picked up.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Adrian, how about you? Want to add one or a couple?
Yeah, I could add many. I think that, what's interesting working across these different hubs, 6 hubs in our network, was that our colleagues took very different approaches to collaborating with decision makers. Many engaging with policymakers from the outset, many more engaging with NGOs and civil society to influence the decision making through those perhaps less direct routes. So, for example, in some regions like Gurgaon in the National Capital Region in India, or indeed in Brighton and Hove in the UK, where I was working, we worked with decision makers as much as possible from the outset, including feeding into formal consultations, convening workshops that involved policymakers, and influencing. I don't think that we can say we drove the decision making, but we influenced decision making around planning, either in urban development or in land use. In other contexts, we actually found that we had to shift our strategies along the way. So an example that's really great is our colleagues from Argentina, Annabelle Marin, Patrick van Zwanenberg, Almendra Kremaski, and others, who again started to work with policymakers to try and influence the new national seed law that was being developed. But later, they shifted their strategy. They opted to move from a defensive approach of trying to lobby Congress over reforms to the seed law, and instead explore a more offensive strategy, as they call it, to create a parallel open source system of seed innovation, which became BioLeft. So this took ideas from open source software and applied them to seed breeding. So not necessarily a shift to policy making or decision making, but a new innovation, which is actually challenging the status quo through action.
Yeah, and creating these totally new opportunities. And in many ways, the examples you just already pointed to, if you will, working around the obstacles. And I want to point particularly to Mariana, if you could say a little bit about the work on conflicts and the importance of conflict transformation and what we've learned through that and how we can, move change along.
Yes, I think the ATAS, but many others of the network have explored resistant processes, conflicts as spaces of thinking about alternatives, different ways of thinking, of doing, words that change our way of thinking. There's a power also in the different word use and vocabularies of resistance. And one of the outcomes of one of the processes that acknowledge has been very important in supporting and consolidating is, for instance, the Global Environmental Justice Atlas, that is an effort to document with communities and with mobilized actors different struggles around the world. And actually this tool that nowadays has more than 3,000, almost 3,700 cases, has been used for informing policy, has been used also to support the formation of networks of resistance and learning. It's being used every day more and more as a learning and teaching tool. So we hope that we can keep on expanding this work, where Acknowledge has been, and the T2S network has been very important in consolidating. And it's still there informing and supporting different transformative processes.
Yeah, wonderful example too of how it, it's not just a 3-year project, right? It is sort of a small glimpse into an ongoing process that persists. Leo, how about you? An example from India or any other place that you have worked?
I think, listening to the dozen plus projects that have, been discussed over the last 2 days, one thing that struck is there's so much of a sense of solidarity across many projects, because as Mariana said, there are structures of power that each one deals with. And these structures of power are not necessarily in thinking about the future of humanity and the future of this planet. They are in a totally different zone. And I think this sort of sharing helps us to realize that we're not alone at one level. And we're not small. We're quite, if we can network, we can be quite powerful and big, and we can make transformation happen, which is progressive and useful. And we have seen that in our own project. For instance, we look at it in terms of using the lens of socio-technical imaginaries and look at nuclear, for instance, nuclear energy. How is it transforming societies? So, for instance, between UK and India, one of the patterns we find is it is so much embedded in the militaristic nation state that has happened in the post-World War II and during the Cold War. And unless we actually contend with the implications of that, we're not going to transform anything really. And so to be able to put it on the table and say, we need to engage with that. So we saw that from the perspective of the so-called Science City, which is projected north of Bangalore, which has disposes thousands of pastoral nomads and agro-pastoral communities, basically to do what? If it is to be a transformation towards sustainability, then the concept of science itself should be one which is not hegemonic, which is not dispossessing, but one which is inclusive. So I think these type of comparative experiences help us to realize that most of the systems of the world, the way money moves, the way political power is moving, is really to sort of exert control over the masses of humanity. And we have seen that through agriculture and through smart city projects. So to ask these relevant questions and very probing and very troubling questions to systems of power, I think itself is transformative. And we were able to engage with that kind of dialogue and dialectic.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And I actually want to ask you a follow-up question. I remember a conversation we had over the course of the last few days here about how, big promises at national policy levels, say in emission reductions, can lead to policies that actually hurt local communities, even though they are meant to, prevent the worst of climate change. Can you speak a little bit about sort of the example that you shared from India and how you navigate this particular, it's like we're trying to get to sustainability in multiple ways, right? So there's not just one way to get to it. Can you speak a little bit to that? I come
from a city which has just been flooded, and it's 1,000 meters above sea level, and it should not get flooded because it's one of the most well-drained cities. The reason it gets flooded is because, yes, climate change, but it's also the way in which power has shaped the city is to ensure that those with privilege are outside the flood zones, and those without privilege are within the flood zones by and large. That is a narrative which is global. But what we also saw with the experience of that city is that when you try to question this system, you find a resistance from those who are holding on to privilege. And what I think really helps us is to get the lens of transdisciplinarity and to be an intersectoral process is extremely critical for true transformation to happen. So, for instance, when you look at the climate change talks that are going on in Egypt now, and you see that there has been no progress at all in the way in which humanity can say, yes, I think we are going to make this a different one. And then you look at what India promises. India says, for instance, we are going to be the leaders in terms of matching the climate change targets. But over the past year, the Indian government has drastically modified 6 major environmental laws, all for the worse. So, and we see that this is not just happening in India, it's happening in China, it's happening in perhaps several countries in Africa, in South America. Yes, there have been transformations in Brazil recently. But the point really is this: unless the world, humanity, through agencies such as the academia, through civil society, are allowed to speak out refreshingly without fear, I don't think we are going to solve the climate change problem. And repression is probably one of the most serious conditioning that we need to tackle with and say, unless academicians, civil society, media finds the freedom to express, we are not going to tackle the seriousness of climate change with the urgency that it demands. That's really one of the big takeaways that I think I have from the past 2 days.
Yeah, wonderful. Haida, I want to bring you back in many ways, not only in your role in ISC, you've obviously worked against the repression of science and bringing the voice of science into political processes, but you're also now working strategically on doing that in Africa, building capacity, building basically the voice of science to a much more prevalent one. And so I'm wondering if you could just reflect on what you're hearing, what that, how that resonates with you compared to what you hoped this program would be about, and why do you think it's important?
So, Susie, clearly there is need for T2 is 3, phase 3. I mean, it's absurd to think, if you think about other domains of sustainability science, be it food or climate, energy, whatever, these programs don't end. There's always need for more, right? So we do need to start thinking about what that more is. And what I'm hearing is, the value of the sort of bottom-up processes, right? But in terms of, and maybe this is because of the way in which, I'm not a researcher, so I'm an institution builder. And so I think also about the top down, and we need to understand what we can do at that level as institutions. And there I feel transformation can't just be the passion and the mission of a closed community of committed people. This has to go much broader. So as wonderful as it is that one has built a community of practice and of like-minded people, the challenge for us is to get others to think like this and to learn from this, right? And I think that's very tough. I think there's a role for the ISC. The ISC has a wealth of knowledge and access to a fantastic global community. So what can the ISC do in terms of, the ISC's own influence is growing within the multilateral system, for example. Somebody started off earlier saying, felt like this program made the impossible possible. So let's think impossible. Let's think about what it would take to put science for survival with the transformation as the agenda behind that on the UN Security Council agenda. Have a debate there. Let's start somewhere. Let's think about that top-down level as well. At Future Africa, this issue of equitable collaboration, global collaboration is very, very central to the work we're doing. But, I just want to give you one example. Yesterday, I met a former leader of a South African opposition party, Lindiwe Mazibuko, and she's a young woman in her 30s, and she has set up an organization called Future Elect, which is doing very, very well. And they are convening and training and supporting the emerging political leaders in South Africa, and it's now being rolled out at a Pan-African level. Future Africa is designing a Future Science Leaders program. And we were like, why don't we introduce the leaders to each other? Why don't we build also as institutions, not just look at our own domains, but start building relations of trust between the next generation that has to get this right, because I have doubts that ours will.
Well, it's a very good point, and I can only confer from the US perspective, where I have a little bit of observational experience, at least, that building up the political leadership is just as important as building up the science capacity. So I want to briefly, before I go on to questions we already have and back to the other panelists, just mention to everyone online and also here in the room, please come and type your questions into the Q&A panel. And then we get to address them here. We have enough time to do that. Heide, there's a question that came in for you, and I want to briefly do that before coming back to the panelists. This is from Marcus Lange, who said, Heide, your presentation was spot on. Many thanks for this exciting journey through the history of Earth system science research. In terms of the challenging transition and bridging between natural and social science, what was and is still ongoing. How would you assess the relevance of core projects of the then Earth system science programs, such as IHDP, Diversitas, IGBP, and the projects that merged into the core projects of the future Earth? Are they still relevant? Or how would you guess their importance today? If they are less important, how could the underlying mechanisms be improved and the relevance increased?
I want to give Marcus my email address, but I won't do that now. Yes, they are highly relevant. I was having a discussion about Future Earth and where we're at just days ago. And my feeling is, and I've always said this, without the core projects and how they have evolved, but without those, it's not much of an international program. It's a nice network. But if we are going to do something impactful with Future Earth, which was set up 10 years ago as a 10-year program, we need to go back to our core projects. And I would also say, Susie, that I am a TD advocate, you know that, but too often these days we forget about interdisciplinarity. We have to remain vigilant about that. And I think those core projects are a vehicle to do that in the sustainability science community.
Yeah, well, thanks for that segue, because it brings really the focus on the question of inter and transdisciplinarity that I want to dig into. What does it actually mean? What does it look like in the lived realities of the projects? How did you do it? What were some of the lessons that you've learned from that? I don't know, Adrian, do you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, sure. I think that again, we've got a lot of learning from each of the different hubs, but just drawing, for example, on, say, the work in the UK, we've been working with across the natural sciences, across the social sciences. But I think something that's come up in the last few days is how we engage with, how we work with the colleagues outside academia, the activists, the NGOs, and the policymakers. How do we choose which ones we actually ally with and collaborate with? And those decisions are very, normative decisions. We need to be very explicit about that. We also need to recognize that we are part of longer transformations processes. And so I think that we went into this project thinking, we're going to start transformations. We've come out of it recognizing that transformations are happening, and we fit into those by contributing social science knowledge, transdisciplinary work. And I think one of the lessons that I've learned is to be responsive to that, responsive to changes, but also really responsive to the needs of those colleagues with whom we are working. So rather than setting our own agendas as researchers, what's interesting, really listening and contributing where we can in order to just help with ongoing transformations that will continue long after individual projects or research interventions.
Can I just follow up with a little bit of more detail? Out of your transformative knowledge network has come this guide to doing transdisciplinarity, if you will, in the T-Labs context? You mentioned several approaches, but that was one. And I'm just wondering, can you make it really real? You know, we don't know who all is on the audience. Maybe everybody knows what TD stands for, transdisciplinarity, but can you say a little bit, what is the difference between TD, say, and traditional disciplinary research, you know, led research?
I actually think about transdisciplinarity to some extent as a way of undisciplining ourselves. When, you know, we've spent, many of us, years, sometimes decades in particular departments in universities. In order to really work effectively, we need to shed a lot of that baggage. We need to work using languages that make sense to people who are getting stuff done, fighting, struggling in the real world, rather than adopting jargon and quite technical approaches. Now, that helps us to work across the natural sciences and the social sciences, but vitally important, it also helps us to communicate really, really clearly with ourselves and with those research partners, those strategic partners that don't necessarily think of themselves as in the business of knowledge creation, but more in the business of action. There's plenty more that I could say, but I think we need to think about the undisciplining ourselves as academics as well.
Great, thank you. Mariana, I want to put it to you. What is it for you? How did you work in this way in your projects?
Yes, maybe building on Adrian's comment that I really liked, I think it's also about challenging the boundaries, no? About who's an expert, who's not an expert, whose knowledge counts, what's knowledge, what is to be a researcher, what's to be an activist, what's to be a community member, what means discipline. So challenge of these boundaries and really engage in a decolonized way, which is difficult because we have to decolonize many things, science, ourselves, how we do research, how we make questions, how we think about methodology. So I think it's about challenging ourselves in new ways. So I think it's also think about new programs and new research is how can research programs allow for that challenging and breaking those boundaries and becoming really innovative if you want. Although I think people is already innovative, maybe we are not in some places. So learning from all those innovations that are happening, different ways of thinking in research and science, and challenging academia spaces as well, because they are also limiting some forms of transdisciplinary challenging research.
Can I follow up with you as well? You raised two interesting issues for me. So one is decolonization of science. Say more. What does it, let's practice what we preach here and
Okay,
take the jargon out. What does it mean to decolonize science?
So yeah, I think it's, you originally, I don't know if you're planning to make this question, was about the research caps. So we were supposed to think about that. And when thinking about that, I thought it would be interesting to make maybe a comment from that perspective. To think that it's not only about research caps that we can propose and discuss here, but it's about really transforming our lenses about which are our approaches, our methods, and perhaps even our questions. So this is something we have been discussing these past 2 days, and many transformative networks members have pointed to the need to decolonize science, research, and even solution approaches, which are really colonizing in a way. So it's not only about co-producing transdisciplinary research with communities and networks in the Global South, but also by challenging and decolonizing ourselves and our research institutions in the process. And if we don't engage in such debate about how we decolonize science and what we do, we may reinforce the unjust and unsustainable relations that are at the root of the global crisis that we are actually trying to address together here.
Yeah, great. I want to come back to you in a minute, but Eleanor, how about you give us an example of how you do the TD research, how you've done it in your context, and lessons you're taking away, maybe even self-transformative lessons.
Thank you very much, Susie. Yes, I think I'll pick up on two slightly different examples that are very much liking what my colleagues are saying about undisciplining ourselves and challenging boundaries. And one of the real learning from the project that I've held with a group of colleagues on artisanal and small-scale gold mining, working with miners who very much are pushed to the margins of debate and demonized within their communities, is how powerful can be the use of art in somehow finding ways to give expression, but also to do things together, to come together in communities to negotiate conflict, not always a comfortable, happy place, but to work on things in ways where it doesn't depend on being a particular type of expert. And I think that has really been a learning for me in terms of the power of transdisciplinary approaches and how art can be used within transdisciplinary approaches. The second point I would like to really bring forward, and I think is a strength of both T2S programs, is in terms of training new generations of researchers to do transdisciplinary research, to work within teams, to be open to different knowledges, different perspectives, but also maybe to be more humble in terms of who they are as experts and working with others and listening to others within the context of the research which they're conducting. I think those would be the examples I give, Susan.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And Leo, how about you?
So I want to say this, suppose if you are sick and you end up in a village which is so far away from any city, you find the entire village community coming together to share their knowledge to help you out of that situation. And I think that's the humanism that is innate to each and every one of us, which I think over a period of time, in the way in which knowledge is produced and held in silos, we have forgotten. And that is why I think the world is so fractured and unable to come to terms with its existential realities and its challenges of trying to transform to another way of living, which doesn't hurt the planet. I think the underpinnings in this is that in such production of knowledge as in a village is that there is equanimity, there is generosity, and there's a willingness to actually assist the well-being of a person. And I think if those values can actually be taken into the academic and the production of knowledge that is happening all over, automatically you come across, and the CBD talks are going on in Montreal, I guess, sometime now. One of the basic features there is that the world's biodiversity, which is so badly destroyed and in trouble, is that the traditional knowledge which is associated with it is being commodified, corporatized, financialized, and made almost impossible to use to save humanity. And we saw that through the pandemic, for instance. One of the biggest challenges of the pandemic, at least from the Indian perspective, was the fact that you couldn't get vaccines if you wanted it. It was beyond your means. The state was unwilling to actually tell the corporates, look, this is about saving lives, not about making profits. So then you really look at it and you deconstruct it and you realize that that is how everything is. The state is not stepping in to actually protect humanity. The state everywhere is protecting profit. So when we work with these type of programs and projects, I think we come face to face with the harshness of this reality. And this, I think, was a very important aspect of this for us in our own work. And we understood what disempowerment really means. And how transdisciplinarity is the key to get out of silos and work, in a network fashion of ensuring knowledge is liberated from the bondages of possession.
Yeah, I think you all bring out a really interesting point again, which is this issue around doing this work in contested, interest-driven, oppressive situations, and as we talked about in the last couple of days, often in violent conflict situations. And I wonder if whoever would like to speak to this could say a few words about, how do we work in those contexts? What difference can we make? Because in many ways, they are, if you will, the hotspots right now of unsustainability, right? And as such, maybe the precursors to much widespread collapse, call it that, or wider incidences of unsustainability. So I'm wondering if any one of you would like to speak to the issue of doing this difficult work of decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our practices, our ideas about what the future looks like in these very precarious situations. Anyone?
I'll just build on what I just said is one of the first things that people who are faced with challenges would like is relief. And relief forces you to actually look at what we have as what we know, and then realize that they are asking for something now. And the fact that you have to produce that response actually forces deeper questions in terms of how we produce knowledge, how we hold knowledge, how we share knowledge. And I think would be a good lens to actually look at the imminence of transformation to sustainability, which alarmingly, I don't find the urgency in the climate talks. And to me, that's frightening. That countries which are the worst affected have to repeatedly appeal for loss and damage funds. I mean, come on, just give the money. You have money to put it into a rocket and send it to Mars where you know you don't have life. And you don't want to put the money here. And I think these are the questions that come up in sharp relief when we work this way.
Yeah. Mariana, much of the work of the Acknowledge Network was in conflict-ridden situations. I wonder if you want to speak to that and maybe to some of the other cases we've heard over the last few days of people working in that context.
Yeah, I think it poses many methodological challenges in terms of for young researchers that go to difficult areas to work, understanding also where you're working, which are the priorities, the needs. And so there's many reflexive processes that we have to address when we think about research in these contexts. And it's also about trying to learn with them in a process where you have to adapt also your research plans in accordance to these certain local context needs and requirements, and negotiate also. So it poses many challenges that I think there's no guidelines. Maybe you have to really have a permanent reflexive process, an adaptive process where you can really try to find the negotiation between all the research needs from your different requirements you have as a researcher, and but also the different situations locally, and position yourself in that dilemma. So yeah, maybe to share the methodological challenge.
Would either of you, Adrian or Eleanor, add to this?
I mean, I could reflect on my experience of working with these colleagues in very different contexts. I wouldn't say that, unlike some of the other projects, I wouldn't say that the Pathways Network was really deeply embedded in conflict situations, but we have learned a lot about how to engage with and work across differences and tensions in very different socio-political systems. So I mean, going to the question about decolonizing our minds, I have learned that there isn't a way to conduct research, to feed into policy. Just as Mariana says, there isn't a recipe book for how to do this. I've learned a huge amount from our colleagues in China. I've learned a huge amount from colleagues across the world. And I'd also point to some of the work that our colleagues from the African Centre for Technology Studies have done on decolonizing research methodologies. I've just shared a blog in the chat, but they, alongside our colleagues in Mexico, had a whole year of work having conversations about how to decolonize research methods for sustainability.
Eleanor, anything you want to add?
I would just add very small, we've heard from colleagues over these 2 days who are working in contexts where don't have voice, where political repression means that academic freedom is cut. As head of research at the Nordic Africa Institute, I work with a network of researchers across the African continent. So this is very real reality that people's lives can be threatened. And one of the things that we try to do is, aside from acknowledging our privilege, is creating safe spaces in which people can come and work. And that is something I will continue to nurture within my day job away from the T2S project.
Yeah. Heidi, I want to put this back to you in some ways. you know, there's a way in which the faster climate change, global changes happen, the worse the conditions on the ground in many ways become, the more we get into authoritarian regimes. There is a distinct danger of actually losing the relevance of science at a moment when it is maybe most needed, besides dealing with the exact immediate needs of people who are hungry, who are thirsty, right? But there is a distinct need to have science inform these very complex, wicked challenges. And yet, in many ways, it is maybe the most difficult time to bring it in. And I'm wondering how you, as a science policy maker, if you will, as someone who is advocating in this space all the time, how do you think about that? How do you help keep science in a relevant place?
So I can't give you a satisfactory answer, Susie, but I can say that it's much easier to think about it at a local level than it is to think about it at a global level. So that's a question you've posed for the new CEO of the ISC. Good luck to him. I am so happy not to have to be thinking constantly about, you know, that global dimension. It's much easier at the local level in terms of making relationships and at an institutional level. So I'm privileged now to Future Africa is hosted by a University of Pretoria, that calls itself a transdisciplinary university, and transdisciplinarity is its strategy. But, you know, I think, okay, when this strategy is done, I want it to be a transformative university, because we must remember that in this contested world, in this world where, you know, a lot of people question the need for scientific evidence, let alone scientific interpretation of mis and disinformation, we need to remember that TD is one approach, and it's not a silver bullet. And we need to deploy now every tool in the toolkit. And some solutions can come from single disciplines, from, you know, from other approaches to research and scholarship. But I do think the relations are important. And for me, the global paradigm of open science is a framework that if we can really implement in its full in all its dimensions, if we can at a university, at institutional levels, implement the practices and principles of open science, we'd be doing a lot. And TD is a part of that, but only a part of it. To be transformative, to have potential to be transformative, I think research also needs to be digitally enabled today, needs to be more futures literate, might need to be decolonized, and TD doesn't capture all of that. So I think we need to think bigger, and you know, we mustn't make, everybody's now on the TD bandwagon. We must now all get them on the transformation bandwagon. And I'd like to see transformative leadership of our institutions to do that.
So say more about that. What does that mean? What does transformative leadership mean? What does it mean to, you know, go beyond transdisciplinarity, or to make transdisciplinarity transformative?
So number one, understand what social transformation means, that it's systemic, that it's disruptive, that it's a long-term game. You have to commit. You can't just have a nice new bilateral initiative. You've got to commit to it. I think that's number one, have the vision, understanding and vision. I think the willingness to take risks and to understand in that regard that changing science systems is urgently necessary in order to enable scientists to do transformative work. And that means giving up on things like rankings and academic assessments, etc. Now, I'm not saying, you know, universities are not going to go it alone, but the leaders of our universities, I'm using the higher education sector, need to start having these conversations urgently.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. I actually want to take this question to each of you. In what ways do you feel you didn't, if you will, only work in a TD way, in a transdisciplinary way, but in what ways were your projects either themselves transformative or in, you know, supporting the transformative momentum that you have found in place? Leo, do you want to start us out?
Yeah, I think one of the first things it does is actually takes research out of the lab in the sense of the classic lab, which is within walls, into the open, into the world, and into areas where actual questions are being lived and contestations are expressed. So transdisciplinary, the approach of transdisciplinary knowledge production requires constant iterative engagement with the lived realities of communities and people, wherever we are choosing to engage in that sense. So in contrast, if you take the formal systems of education, it is about creating knowledge as if it's a private property. And I think by ensuring that people realize that to understand knowledge as the commons, knowledge as emancipatory, these were the goals why universities were set up, why academia was funded by public monies. And somewhere we lost course and we went off into a different direction. I think the potential is enormous to use projects like this to return to that pathway, where humanism, where equality and questions of equity are not necessarily written in journals which are so far removed from the lived realities of people, of course, because of paywalls, you can't even access them, but to ensure that it informs public policy, ensure that it influences government structures, ensure that it actually affects the politics of the day in ways which you are going to say, yes, you know what, I was part of this transformation. You know, that relationship of ensuring that there is a change which is possible and we actually secure it. I think that's the exciting part of working through these processes.
Which requires for researchers to become truly public intellectuals as opposed to
I think
just
it's a given that,
academicians.
education to me is a public product. It was never a private good. So if you can live with that and stay with that for a moment and say, if this life of ours on this planet has to be worth it, if it is only to accumulate without sharing, what's the point of it?
Yeah. Eleanor, would you like to contribute?
Well, very in a small way, perhaps. I think we within our project and program have grappled with some way the existential urgency of transformation, which as researchers can be quite disempowering. And I think that one of the things we've sought to do is somehow foster the conditions for transformation in terms of building relationships and trying to make steps towards changing mindsets to be open to transformative change. And especially I think this feeds into what Leo was saying very nicely just now, that to be recognizing that there isn't one expert knowledge around the table, and in some ways the democratization of knowledge being so important. Thank you.
Adrian, how about you?
I mean, you asked how was the work transformative, and I think that it was such an amazing opportunity to conduct research engagement with an explicit focus on action and change, rather than the kind of knowledge products, and Leo was using the word product, that we're usually incentivized to produce in our institutions. Now, we did produce those, but actually the mandate of the program was about much, much more. And I think that many of us who've been involved in the program, many of the earlier career researchers, but also the more established ones, have had our views of our mandate, our role within academia transformed as a result of being given this opportunity. Some have gone on to leave academia to set up NGOs or to focus their work in other organizations or other organizational contexts. And some of us continue on in research institutions. But I mean, another thing that we've learned over the last couple of days is that many people feel they're doing this within universities despite the incentive structures that they're working under, rather than supported by the incentive structures. And so I think that those of us who remain in academia, if we've been transformed, we need to keep putting pressure on those institutions to change the incentive structures and really put a value on that public good, not so much products, but the public, benefits that this kind of research has enabled us to do.
Yeah. Mariana, how about you?
I think many great things have been said, just maybe to recover, maybe to recover one, I think, important concept, which is the caring in our research. Caring of, when we think about research, young researchers, colleagues, institutions that we want to improve, but also when we are publishing this also that was mentioned during today's, is really recognizing all the work that has been involved in producing the research we do, communities, people that maybe do things that in a typical scientific approach would be considered marginal, to put it, to recognize all that work. In that is involved the communities that are involved in the research, the local researchers, because they are local researchers. So I think there's also more to be said and thought about of caring. And to recognize all these co-produced, the co-production we want to do also in the different products we have, and the teaching, bringing communities to the classrooms as teachers, because I think they are those teaching us many times. So I think we also have to bring them to the classroom. Sometimes we try, it's difficult, but I think it's an effort worth doing. And they inspire much more our students and ourselves, this is for sure. So also recognize all that inspiration that we can share with other communities.
Thank you. There's one question in the Q&A I want to come to, and again, encourage all of you, and including folks here in the room, if you have questions to the panelists, if you want to highlight something from the last couple of days, please put it in the Q&A. And so here's this question. It would be important to identify new needs for human development and strategic foresight, try to address multiple views, mining science and others. I think that's what it meant. Do you believe these methods can still be valid for the next generation for the paradigm change that we're hoping for? Elena, you want to speak to that?
Well, I'm not quite sure that I've understood the question, but one of the points that has come up through these days, which I think speaks to that question, is that the methods themselves aren't transformative. It's how they're used and how they're integrated. And in that way, replying to the question, yes, I do think that there is vast wealth of learning on methodologies and approaches that can be taken into future research. I hope I've understood the question there.
And the person who, yes, Heide, please go next.
It makes me think about the use of the word foresight, makes me think of what we're doing now with the folks who run the Futures Literacy work at UNESCO. And we're establishing a Futures Literacy incubator at Future Africa. And actually the idea is to say, when you start a TD project, you've got your stakeholders, your communities, whoever you have in the room. Something we don't think about ever is, what are their assumptions about the future? And do they know what our assumptions are? And the Futures Literacy laboratories are a very effective tool to, first of all, expose those assumptions to each other, to expose how our imaginings of the future are locked into practices of the past, and to equalize the playing field, because nobody owns the future. No one can predict it, no one owns it, but we colonize it. So we've started experimenting with, is our Futures Literacy labs a good way to kickstart TD projects? And, you know, we've just started with this, but there's a lot of interest from the university community to do this.
You know, the example you give is actually a really good example of much of the work that has been going on in these projects, right? With essentially not people talking only to themselves, but exposing themselves to very different ways of looking at a particular situation, reframing it, understanding it in new ways. And that in and of itself, this, you know, we've come to sort of call it a transformative labor, that hidden work often is essential to open up new pathways, to open up new possibilities, and to give people a sense that they have agency over their actions that move them to maybe a more livable future. So I think it's, thank you for that example. It sort of really illustrates the kind of work that you know, everyone in the room is super humble about what they've actually achieved. And in all the places that they've been, that has happened, and it has transformed the scientists involved themselves, but it also has transformed the people with whom they have worked. So great example. Anyone want to take on more of the question of how you've transformed, or what you have taken from this work of opening up minds, transforming the possibilities in the places in which you have worked? You want to start, Leo?
I would like to start with the term transformative. It's not a mild word. It is a very, very powerful word, and it's a revolutionary concept. So if you are engaged in transformative research, I think we are being revolutionaries in terms of questioning, contesting all the processes and frameworks by which knowledge has been produced, knowledge is being produced, and unpacking knowledge in terms of looking at it from how colonization has affected us, imperialism has affected us, in terms of how the world is. And so these are the possibilities that T2S provides. You don't find it in a normal college or a normal public institution or a normal university. When I say normal, I don't mean to say we are abnormal, but I think we are pushing the idea of what can be normalized to such a level that you can probably imagine that the world is a learning place, and you can imagine the classroom being outside the class and learning actively with the transformations that are going on in the world, and ensuring that the response of academia, of researchers, of activists is in step with the world's transformations. And I feel that if that shift could take place, we can achieve sustainability quite quickly and not make the kind of choices. I want to give an example here. For instance, India has pitched 450 gigawatts as the ambition at which it is going to produce renewables. But in our work through the TTS project, we found that wherever solar parks have been installed, it has led to displacement, dispossession, and destruction, and in many ways is reproducing the same type of problems that large hydro or large nuclear projects produce. So what are we really doing? If you are producing this electricity, for whom is that electricity? And we are also saying, for instance, the Great Indian Bustard is crashing into the power line and becoming the first bird to be extinct, first species to be extinct, by shifting towards renewables. So you actually have this within a span of 5 or 10 years. What would take 200, 300, maybe a century, millennium, is happening within a matter of few years. So I think to closely examine these type of transformations that are going on and ask the questions that we are asking through this process is a very, very, very critical part of shaping the type of public policy that can result.
Yeah. So I want to get us into, Heidi, did you just want to speak to that? Okay, great. I want to get us to a closing round of each one of you to speak to maybe your most precious moment or your most, exciting takeaway from this project, from this program, and maybe just to leave the audience with a good idea, a good sample of really why is it worth doing this kind of work, even if it is often invisible or, important, but not yet leading to all the outcomes that we would like to see. So, Adrian, you want to start us off?
Yeah, maybe, it's not yet, leading to the outcomes. But what we've built is a cohort of incredible young researchers, especially, who are able to work across disciplines, work across other stakeholders, other colleagues outside academia to actually drive change. And maybe it's not happened yet, but I think with that, there is the potential for these transformations to sustainability to happen faster and to happen in more just and inclusive ways.
Yeah.
So that's why it's worth doing this work.
Building the capacity for the change. Yeah, really love that. Mariana, how about you?
Yeah, maybe I think that to defend that the fact that we are looking at maybe local, grassroots, or maybe small transformations doesn't mean they are small. So I think there's also something to say about the power of all these transformations that start maybe small locally, but really are transforming the world in different ways. And we see this in many countries in Latin America, in many places. So I do think there is there's a high value in supporting and co-producing learning with and from all these processes of resistance and transformation, because there's where new imaginaries are coming, new ways of understanding, practices, and ways of being and doing. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in this bottom-up approach to transformations that is transforming institutions worldwide. But I do agree that I'm really concerned with the direction we are seeing globally. We are seeing an increase in violence. There's each year more and more environmental activists being killed worldwide. Violence for researchers, local researchers, for journalists, for activists is going up. So there's an urgency to address these processes to allow for transformations. So maybe this is something we need to engage with in more globally,
Yeah.
locally. Yeah.
You remind me of Andrew Sterling's image of murmurations of all these different activities going on all over the world, and we're maybe need to see more collaterally almost what's all happening and in which direction it's moving, and it is in contestation, I guess, with the other forces, right, that take us into a different direction. Eleanor, how about you?
I have many precious moments, but I'm going to give two. And one is from Northern Ghana, from Tamale, in July, where the artist that we were working with, Niobadai, ran an exhibition with gold miners that we were working with. And one of the intentions of our work was somehow to give dignity and humanity to people who are in a very, very complex situation in relation to sustainability. And my precious moment is seeing this fantastic exhibition with over 200 guests coming and gold miners being interviewed by the media, talking to academics from around the world about their lives and about transformation within that community and that region of Northern Ghana. That's my one precious moment. My second precious moment is something that everybody behind me sitting in the audience will relate to, was seeing my two of my PhDs from our project take the lead on part of the workshop, talking about their methodologies, talking about their research. I was like a mother hen listening to this yesterday. I was just so proud. So that's another precious.
Thank you, Eleanor. How about you, Leo?
Well, I think, I don't work in an academic institution, so I can relate with the type of moment which happened when we had the GOST project meeting in Bangalore. It's the Governance of Social Technical Transformation project. And one of our associates is a leader of the farmers in the state I come from. And his question still resonates. And I think that's a question that can travel around the world. And he said that, we understand the idea of progress, but when you create this idea of the so-called science city and take away from us resources which for 1,000 years we have managed successfully, sustainably, and then you tell us we don't know how to live and you're going to teach us how to live. I think there's something wrong with your understanding of how to live. These are very simple wisdoms that come out when you actually work with people. Most knowledge today is written up and reproduced without deeply introspecting and examining what exactly is being communicated. But if Karyana's question, for instance, was to be the question which is always there in every classroom and every lab and every research project, I think it is a type of conscientiousness that is required, which processes like this really help us to be aware of and alert.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Haida, I want to give you the almost last word here, which is to reflect a little bit. You've watched this program evolve over 10 years. You've heard a little bit now of what we've learned, what you've seen come out of it in terms of just the capacity we have built, the conversations we have changed. I wonder if you have any sort of thoughts on, just how you feel about this program, having led it, and how you want to see what you want it to be the seed of in the future, I guess.
So thank you, Susie. And I must say that what makes me proud is to listen to the passion and the engagement of panelists like this. And I know that they are representative of a much broader set of researchers, and to have been part of making that possible is great. So, I wanted to also add on that note and on what I see as coming next. So in 1994, when I think it was my first serious job in science policy in South Africa, I was given the task of establishing a national funding program for the social sciences, and it was on global change and social transformation. And here I am back in the country running an institute around transformative research. So, you take every chance you get. We've got to continue, and we've got to shift. We've got to take stock of where the debate is at, who's on board, what has changed in the last decade in this discussion, in the discussion with the social sciences. So this program needs to continue, but in different forms. And, I'd be so delighted to be part of those brainstormings. Let me finish by saying, I really mean this. We mustn't underestimate how transformative this program itself was as an initiative. It enabled the International Science Council, which was a failing organization when I joined in 2007, to no individual's fault, but just generally ISSC could not sit around the table with ICSU. We had nothing to show. And this program allowed us to take conversations that were, decades before the merger intention was announced, intention for the two to merge. 10 years before that, we started talking about a merger between ISSC and ICSU. And the problem was always the ISSC had nothing to show. And T2S changed that fundamentally. It transformed the nature of the discussion. It allowed us to engage with our natural science colleagues on an equal footing. And that made the merger of ICSU and ISSC, and therefore ISC and the success it's now pursuing, that made it possible. So kudos to the ISSC at the time and to all the researchers who've shown what we can do. So again, we've made a lot of people said the merger, it's impossible, you're mad, get another job. We made it possible. So transformation has to be as well.
Thank you so much, Heide. And I think if you were here, you would share in the pride and see how everyone here shares in that pride of having contributed to it. So I want to close us out. It's at the bottom of the hour here. And thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the audiences globally and to folks here in the room. It's been wonderful to have this closing event. Thank you, Mariana, for bringing everyone to the world. I really appreciate that. The webinar has been recorded and will be available on the ISC website, where people can also learn more about each of the underlying projects. You've seen much of that scroll through the chat, including a number of films that have been made, so to make us really real to you of what the work has been. And so to us, this is the final goodbye on this project, but it is not the end of transformation. It's certainly not the end of social science importance in these conversations. So thank you all for contributing. Thank you all of the panelists for your great thoughts. Thank you, Heide, for coming to us from South Africa, and goodbye.